Welcome to today's Sunday broadcast, The Discipline of Silence. Now, before we begin, I'd like to tell you two stories, separate but tangentially related. For the first story, I would ask you to open your Bible to the third book of Kings, chapter 19. That's 1 Kings for those of you using the King James. Starting at verse 9. And when Elias was come thither, he abode in a cave. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him. And he said to him, What dost thou here, Elias? Drop to verse 11. And the Lord said to him, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passeth. And a great and strong wind before the Lord, overthrowing the mountains and breaking the rocks in pieces. The Lord is not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake. The Lord is not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire. The Lord is not in the fire. And after the fire a whistling of a gentle air. And when Elias heard it, he covered his face with his mantle. And coming forth, stood in the entering in of the cave. Here endeth the lesson, thanks be to God. Now, if you attend the Novus Ordo, that would have been your first reading or your lesson for today. I want you to keep that in mind. The main takeaway being that God was not in the loudness or the clamoring of the wind or the storm or the fire, but in the silence. Now, a tangential story. My own life. I was 15 years old in 1989, and I was talking to a friend named Kristen. I went over to her place, and we were working on something psychically, and we began meditation. Now, the way I was taught to meditate was in darkness and in silence. I was actually taught what I call the sit and breathe method, where you sit and you breathe in and out. We'll get back to that in a moment. Where she had a stick of incense burning, she had music in the background. It was completely distracting. I'm not knocking what works for her, but the one thing that I noticed was a complete lack of silence. Now, keeping that in mind, we move on to the conception of silence. We find that silence is a spiritual discipline in pretty much all the great religions and all the great spiritual traditions, East and West. Silence, it's not just the lack of talking. It's the cutting out of distraction, cutting out of outside stimuli, and actually getting to what is within yourself and that true inner voice. And hopefully that presence of God which is within us, just as the presence of God is within all creation. It is that breaking through. In fact, I'm not making this up. I'm not the only person that says this. If we continue further, I'm going to read to you from Spiritual Traditions for the Contemporary Church. This is a compilation from Robin Moss and Gabriel O'Donnell. And in one of the entries, The Pure Gold of Silence, written by Father Stephen Rossetti, he says, Silence is hard, but every spiritual discipline, East or West, modern or traditional, advocates prolonged periods of silence as part of a spiritual training. What is silence? Why is it so important? And why is it so hard? Silence is a complex and multifaceted spiritual reality. First of all, we can say that it has an ascetical function. It is an exercise in self-discipline. We are not used to silence. Every moment of our waking day is filled with sounds and noises. And when there is a moment of quiet, we feel uncomfortable. Reflect on that a little bit. Now, that was written in 1990, 33 years ago, long before the advent of smartphones and social media and computers in every home and even the internet as we know it. The closest we had to the internet back then were the bulletin board systems. It was a local phone number. You call a bulletin board. If you were lucky, the line wouldn't be busy. And stay on the sysop's good side or they will ban you. And they might ban you, and their friends might ban you from their boards too. We live lives filled with distraction. How many of us, for example, take our phones with us when we go to the bathroom and either watch YouTube or Netflix or play solitaire or whatever game is popular now? It's distraction upon distraction, and we compile distraction upon ourselves on top of the usual live, work, exercise type of things that we do. It's just distraction over distraction. So what Father Rossetti says here resonates even more today. We fill ourselves with distractions. We fill ourselves with something to do, as though the one thing we can't stand is being bored. I get it. I don't like to be bored either. I totally get it. That's something else we're going to talk about. Now, another discussion is found in Craig Williams' Entering the Desert, page 57, which I was not smart enough to bookmark beforehand. Shame on me. Page 57, he starts a chapter on the cell. The concept of desiring to escape the world and personal challenges by seeking consolation in supposed spiritual transcendence is not an option in the desert realm of the soul. Extremely well said. Spirituality is not about running away from the world's challenges. It is about finding the strength to overcome those challenges. This is a radically heretical concept which stands in strong opposition to the majority of traditional Gnostic thought. I want to stop there for a second because I confirmed this in a phone conversation with him a few weeks ago, where I asked him if he uses the word Gnostic to refer to knowledge gained by experience, and he said yes. Actually, I think his exact words more like exactly. But yeah, so that's how he's using the word Gnostic. And yeah, a lot of traditional Gnostic thought does involve escaping the realm of matter, either the demonization of matter, the minimalization of matter. We actually see this in a number of modern philosophical traditions where this idea has been enshrined. I've talked about those before. I'm not going to talk about those now. And I really should have bookmarked these. And what he refers to is the private space of the desert Gnostic is as vital an environment as the mystical space shared by the teacher, mentor, and the disciple. Both of these spaces are unique climates containing the potential for a type of hesychasm, the cultivation of silence, facilitating the full maturation of the process of self-realization. In desert gnosis, this is referred to as the cell, which the devotee retires from the public domain in order to methodically work on spiritual praxis. So again, we had an emphasis on silence, we had an emphasis on solitude. We have an emphasis, and Craig draws very much from Eastern traditions. And here he has an emphasis on silence, which he actually expands on later in the book, where he talks about spending several days in nature in silence. Last but not least, as we close our very brief survey of spiritual traditions in silence, I'm going to read to you from The Golden Dawn by Israel Regardie. And this is the edition, I believe it was indexed and edited by Donald Tyson. In this edition is the 6th edition. It's page 93. As the initiate begins to realize the tremendous miracle of words, the magic both good and evil of human communion by words, he will begin to grasp why the order reiterates the importance of silence. The true magician must understand his tools, and, in periods of silence, he must contemplate words as one of them. As he thus traverses the long road to dispassionate self-knowledge, and no longer has to waste energy in doing battle for and indulging wounded feelings in defense of a totally false idea of himself, he is led to meditate on the varied symbols of the cross, and from this to contemplate the crucified one, revealed to the West as Jesus of Nazareth. So, I like to think that I've just given a very brief, but enough of a survey to show the value of silence in multiple paths and multiple traditions, including the tradition that is foundational to modern Western occultism, specifically modern Western Anglosphere occultism. With this in mind, we move forward. What is silence? I mentioned before, many people think of silence as just keeping your mouth shut. However, is it silence if you are hearing the neighbor's stereo? Is it silence if you're hearing children playing outside quite loudly? Is it silence if you are distracted by your phone? You're keeping your mouth shut, but you're watching YouTube videos. Is that silence? Yes and no. Silence, at least as I'm going to use the term today, is a turning within, a turning away from outside distraction. That noise, that distraction, it's only a distraction insofar as you allow it to distract you, insofar as you are able to allow it to distract you. It can be a huge distraction. It can be a minimal distraction. It can be no distraction at all. Your ability and your permission are what's required here. And the discipline, the training in silence, it's a training to prevent that distraction. I remember a scene in the Robin Hood movie from 93 with Kevin Costner in it. I think it was 93. I might be wrong on that. Where he's teaching Marion how to shoot, and he asks her, can you shoot amidst distraction? And then he provides a distraction. The entire object of that lesson, and this is a lesson in marksmanship in general, the entire point of that lesson is, can you tune out the distraction and develop focus on your target enough to aim and to fire and to hit your target regardless of what is going on around you? And in the middle of a fight, in the middle of a big fight, that's an important lesson. Now internalize this lesson, whether in spiritual development or especially in spiritual combat. In spiritual combat, you will have a lot of things attempting to distract you, whether a hostile entity or a hostile magician throwing whatever they can at you. These are distractions. Bad things happening in your life, that's a distraction. Can you tune out the noise and focus on your target, focus on your goal? And this is the benefit of silence. We develop silence as a spiritual discipline. We develop silence, which has its own thunder. We have a colloquial expression, the silence is deafening. And it is. We develop that silence inside of ourselves. We develop that. And as we do, we develop that inner communication with that piece of divinity that is within ourselves, that piece of God, that divine spark that is within ourselves. Silence is powerful. Silence is loud. Silence is deafening. It is thunderous in its own right. Especially in our world where we are not used to it. Especially in our own world where I would dare say we have been programmed to be not used to it. So, actually, no, I'm not going to get to that part yet. In fact, I would say that even if we were to compare traditional versus contemporary worship services, traditional services, they tended to be more quiet, more meditative. If you walked into a Latin Mass prior to 1969, actually vernacular started being used wide scale in 1964. Vernacular Masses were said since 1947, and that's okay. That's okay. My point is, if you walk in, it was a time of quietude. It was a time of active participation being interior. You could follow along in your hand missal. You could read any number of meditations that were provided in your prayer book for different parts of the Mass. You could sit there and say your rosary. In fact, it was commonly recommended to say the sorrowful mysteries during Mass and meditate on the sorrowful mysteries. You were there so that you could provide your inner silence and connect with God in whatever way connected with God individually. While the Mass was there to provide the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ for you communally. So you had the vertical and the horizontal dimensions. The vertical dimension happened in the pew. The horizontal dimension happened at the altar. How different is that from what we got after 1969? Where the emphasis on active participation was moving your mouth when the book tells you to move your mouth. Saying, and also with you, or and with your spirit, when the book tells you to. Out external participation. Participating along with the crowd, rather than participating internally and individually. It's distraction. It's noise. It's actively anti-silence. It's actively anti-internalization. So we have a drastic difference. Whereas in contemporary worship services, depending on where you go, it could be anywhere from traditional hymnody with you moving your mouth when you're told to, i.e. distracting you from that inner silence meditation, or it could be like really loud rock concert and a laser light show. My point being, contemporary worship has removed the opportunity for going inward and connecting with that divine spark during the one time of the week when many people have their only opportunity. Consider your work day. Either you're raising children, or you're doing work around the house, or you're going to your job, or you're doing homework from school. We have so many things on our plate that hour or so on Sunday morning may be the only time that we get to nourish that connection with the divine. So, moving on from that, how do we incorporate silence into our lives? Insofar as we have time, and insofar as we're not too tired by the end of the day, just sit. I mentioned before that I was taught to meditate in darkness and in silence. I was taught the sit and breathe method. That's what I call it, maybe somewhat mockingly. Because you sit, close your eyes, breathe in through the nose, hold it for a few heartbeats, out through the mouth, hold it for a few heartbeats, breathe in again through the nose, rinse and repeat. That's the way I was taught. What I found are two things. The first thing is that the breathing is a distraction for me. So what I do is I sit there. It's a distraction. I sit there. Just breathe through the nose as my body tells me I need to stay alive. The second thing, and there actually are different ways to approach the breathing. One traditional method is to focus on the breathing. Focus your mind on your breathing until the point where you don't have to. For me, it just works just to stay quiet and only breathe when needed. Another thing I noticed is total darkness, I have a difficulty focusing. So leave on a light, like a slight lamp or even a night light. Just in a far corner of the room where it's not really a distraction. I found that helps. My point here is you will find what works best for you, but you have to start with some established method, whether from your teacher, be it from a teacher, from a book, or whatever. You have to start with some established method and then tweak it until you find what works best. I also found that sitting at night, you've seen the recliner I have in the blue room. It's still there. I thought of bringing it here, but I'm keeping it in the blue room. I thought of keeping it. I thought of it, but I sit there at night and just listen. Listen to the cars pass by. Listen to the sound of somebody walking past the house. Just listen. And through listening, see, that's also an exercise in training clairaudience. Through listening, though, it becomes more than just a training exercise. I noticed that my mind would tune it out. My mind would just go inward. Silence was established. And distraction was no longer a distraction anymore. The inner strength to tune out distraction is what was being developed as well, as a side effect, along with the exercise in developing clairaudience. Hearing beyond hearing, while also connecting with that inner silence. And in that inner silence, there is a connection with the inner voice. Not the inner voice that just chatters all the time, like when somebody's talking to you, you're thinking about what you're saying next. Not just that inner voice, but your true inner voice. And the inner voice of that inner voice connecting with the divine spark within. And that is the virtue of silence as a spiritual discipline. In the Old Testament reading for today's Novus Ordo, Elijah encountered God in the silence. Actually, Elijah is a King James term. It's Eliyahu. We just celebrated his feast on July 20th. Eliyahu, or Elias in the Septuagint and in the New Testament. He discovered God in the silence. We discovered God's presence. Not in the loudness, not in the clashing. And there may be some people who can discover God, who can discover God's presence in the rock concert and the laser light show that constitutes many contemporary church services. Or in the constantly saying, and with your spirit, we lift up our hearts, and so on and so on. The outer participation that comes with the Novus Ordo and the Protestant liturgies that are based on it, or that developed in tandem to it. There was a pre-Vatican II and a post-Vatican II Protestant period too, just as there is a pre- and post-Vatican II Catholic period. Because the liturgical movement cut across, it was a multi-denominational effort. It was not just one church or one denomination. There are people who can. Yet, the most serious, and in my discovering of the discipline of silence, I actually saw this is grown-up spirituality. That's the phrase that came to my mind. This is where the human truly meets the divine upon the altar of the heart. 8 years ago, I published a video before I revealed my voice saying the first words of spirituality are the first 10 words of the Mass. I shall go unto the altar of God, to God who giveth joy to my youth. Now, it's 10 words in Latin. Introibo ad altare Dei. 4 words. Ad Deum qui laetificat juventutem meam. 6 words. So those are the first 10 words in Latin of the Mass. And I interpreted that as saying the altar of God is our heart. Going inwards into our heart is where we make the point of contact between the human and the divine. Now that phrase, ad Deum qui laetificat juventutem meam, to God who giveth joy to my youth. Now, if you're used to the King James or other translations that are based on the Masoretic text, you'll get to God my exceeding joy, or even the God of my joy and gladness. That's a difference in source text traditions. I'm not going to address that right now. I'm sticking with the Latin text that is in front of me when I say Mass on Wednesday mornings. to God who giveth joy to my youth is traditionally interpreted as our spiritual youth. And one thing in spirituality is remaining spiritually young. I'm not sure what spiritually old actually means. I made a comment on Facebook last night about old souls. How can a soul be old if time does not exist outside of the physical? And I got some very interesting comments. I'll leave you to read that on my wall as you so desire. For those of you who may be watching the backup recording on YouTube, I wrote that post on, what was yesterday? August 12th, 2023. Now you have a date reference so you can go look for it. My point is, though, spiritual youth, ever remaining as a babe who enters the kingdom of God. Ever remaining so. And that silence, the entering into the heart, gives us the opportunity to retain our spiritual youth or to gain it if we had ever lost it. Well, regain is probably a better word. That spiritual youth, that spiritual innocence. So silence has a number of benefits. You know me, I'm teleologically oriented. So my question is, how do we benefit from this? And the benefits of silence are immense. They are thunderous. They were thunderous for Elias. They are thunderous in the monastic traditions. They are thunderous, as Craig Williams tells us in his books. And they are thunderous, as we also find in the teachings of the Golden Dawn. I personally am not a Golden Dawn practitioner. My stance on the system, it has softened over the years. Actually, my stance on a lot of things has softened, which is another benefit of silence. We get past our own hubris, and we get past our own damn ignorance, which I should probably talk about, even though I had intended to save this for another video. I think you already know that as far back as when I started the Chocolate page, being a young 24-year-old that I was in 1998, I was very clear that the only true Western mystery tradition is that of traditional Roman Catholicism. And I still am in orbit around that proposition. However, that does not mean that other traditions or other paths cannot get you somewhere. The one thing that Nostra Aetate got right, the one thing that Vatican II got right, even though it may have gone a little bit too far, is saying the Catholic Church denies nothing of what is true in other religions. And Catholicism has always held that other religions contain at least some kernel of truth through natural revelation. The same can be said of other spiritual traditions, be it the Golden Dawn, be it the Aurum Solis, be it Martinism, be it Rosicrucianism, be it going further back, the Oratory of Divine Love, and so on and so forth. And the same can be said of Eastern traditions too. One cannot look at the Four Noble Truths or the Noble Eightfold Path and claim that there is absolutely nothing in there that is true. There is truth in there. The Four Noble Truths are very much an expression of natural revelation. Really, you've heard my talk on the Four Noble Truths before, and they were discovered by silence. In my take, I always threw shade at other traditions, especially the Golden Dawn, which I refer to as Victorian-era tomfoolery. And I will admit, it does come off to me as that. It does. But at the same time, the system does get results. There are many people who have gotten good results from the system. And you know me, I'm an empiricist at heart. I do not argue against solid results, ever. So, by getting over myself, by getting over my hubris and my ignorance, and silence is what did it for me. Keeping my mouth shut and paying attention and listening and freaking learning, I was able to overcome many of my biases. I was able to overcome many of my confirmation biases. Even though I hold that traditional Catholicism is the is the sole living successor of the Western mystery tradition. And by living, I mean that can actually trace itself back. I do not dispute the legitimacy of other paths or other traditions insofar as they produce valid, positive results in their practitioners. Those that do not produce positive results in their practitioners, obviously I'm going to remain biased against them because they are not producing positive results. We could be talking about cults. We could be talking about paths of self-sabotage. We could be talking about paths of counter-initiation. Insofar as they produce a net negative, obviously they are bad ways to go. But a path that produces a net positive is a good way to go. And it is through silence, rather than constantly running my mouth, that I learned and I realized and I discovered. So this, in a nutshell, is the power of silence. The power of silence brings us into closer union with God. It brings us into closer union with ourself. It brings us into closer union with our guardian angel, something I did not talk about, but you will discover on your own as you practice silence. It brings us into closer union with our spiritual path and with our fellow man. Ironically, it does that by showing us to overcome the walls that we build between ourselves and our neighbor. Yes, I am a firm believer that in the physical world, good fences make good neighbors. And that's largely because I like my solitude. I like my privacy. I am a loner by nature. However, there is some point where we have to reach your hand across that fence and reach out to our fellow man. And it is our silence, our willingness to listen, and our refusal to let ourselves be distracted by things that are of no importance whatsoever, by background noise, that give us that strength to reach out to our neighbor, that strength to walk with our neighbor, to walk with God, and to walk with ourselves, and even to be compassionate with ourselves and with our neighbor as the occasion suggests or requires. So my hope today is that you have gotten some more information on the value of silence in our spiritual practice and even in our mundane practice. And I recommend that you incorporate it, even if just for 20 minutes a day. It could be in the evening if you're not too tired, in the morning if you wake up early enough before going to work, or whenever you are able to fit it in. 20 minutes of silence. Don't talk. If your mind runs crazy, then let your mind run crazy. Just tell your mind, you know what? Go ahead and think whatever you're going to think. I'll just stand over here doing my thing. Just say that to yourself. That's an old trick for quieting the mind because eventually the mind runs out of things to say. Do that and just practice the silence. If the mind is too chatty, then just listen to the sounds from outside. Or focus on one sound from outside. Just pay attention to that. If it's a stereo, focus on maybe the bass line, or focus on the rhythm track or whatever. But spend time in silence. Develop that inner connection, that inner strength. And develop yourself on your spiritual path. And may the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Amen.